I'm Mick Mulvaney. I was the chief of staff to President Trump for about 15 months from late 2008 to March of 2020. That took us from the government shutdown at the end of 2018 through the first impeachment, through meetings with world leaders, including dinner with Kim Jong-un and a meeting with Kim Jong-un at the DMZ, which was a bizarre sort of story, all the way through the beginnings of COVID. At the outset of COVID, I was the chair of the then unnamed COVID task force in the White House. And what I do, Rebecca, what that job is, what the chief of staff job is essentially the one person who gets paid to tell the president stuff he doesn't want to hear, which is why it's a
specifically Trump, not even just the president. You're telling Trump stuff that he doesn't want to hear, and that's a different ballgame, I can imagine.
There's a shelf life on chief of staff. There's a reason he had four in the first term. But what I'd like to do when I speak in public to groups, especially business groups, is do the same thing, which is tell them stuff they might not want to hear. I'm not there to campaign for Donald Trump. I'm not there to campaign against Donald Trump. I'm not there to campaign for Republicans or against Democrats. I try to tell people or explain to people how Trump thinks, how he works, how he processes information, where he goes to for input. I use the stories that I've collected to try and say, look, this is what happened. This is sort of how we got there. And then this is how you can use that today to try and influence outcomes, try and gain access, try and do whatever. Look, one easy one, it's no surprise that you see an inordinate number of advocacy issues right now covered in advertisements on Fox News in the United States. Donald Trump is one of the largest consumers, individual consumers of news that you have ever met. He reads 4 newspapers cover to cover every single day. He watches cable news almost constantly every single day. Man only sleeps about 4 hours a night. He sleeps from about 2 until about 6, and he's constantly consuming information. I talk about how he does it, where he gets it, and then also implied in that is if you are trying to figure out a way to advocate for a cause or something like that, how do you do the same thing that other people have figured out?
I thought that he didn't like Fox News anymore, but you also can't necessarily believe everything he says.
He watches MSNBC every single day.
That's why he hates it so much, because he knows everything they say.
There's an article about me in one of the newspapers, one of the rags in Washington, D.C., and I came in the office that morning. He says, Mick, not a good story about you, not a good story. What's going on? You got to get good press. Mr. President, let me ask you a question. He goes, what's that? I said, why is it that you know that everything you read about yourself in the New York Times is a lie, but you believe everything about everybody else that the New York Times writes about to be the gospel truth? And he laughed. He said, yeah, I guess you're probably right. So yeah, it's a conundrum, but it's something you have to figure out a way to navigate.
The second term he's come in with, he knows how it all works. He's come in with a lot more sort of bravado. And we've seen, for example, his first 100 days were incredibly tumultuous, and he was stirring the pot. Part of what you do is help companies and audiences understand how he thinks.
Yeah.
So if you could just sort of, without giving it away, because that's very, high.
I'll give one. So when Donald Trump, everybody I think who follows American politics at all, and I assume if they're considering having me come speak to them, they follow it a little bit. If you recall the day he came out with Benjamin Netanyahu and said, you know what, I've got an idea on Gaza. We're going to take it over, and we're going to make it a beautiful Mediterranean resort. There's going to be golf courses and casinos and hotels and so forth. And of course, the whole world just gasped at that, including the United States of America. That's a wonderful example of how Donald Trump thinks, processes information, and then sort of rolls it out to the public. He thinks out loud to a certain extent. And one of the artworks, one of the things of trying to figure out Donald Trump is, when I ran the West Wing, we used to have what's called the Trump-o-meter. When Trump said something, you had to sort of guess, was that a 30% decision that he'd made, or was it a 95% decision that he made? Or was it a trial balloon, for example? That's what Gaza was. I remember when he came out and said, we're going to take over Gaza and make it resorts and so forth. I said, yeah, that's not going to last 24 hours. And it didn't. By the next day, in fact, I think later that day, the White House team was already sort of reeling that back in. That's the art of sort of watching and reading Donald Trump, is trying to figure out, okay, is this an idea that he is floating to sort of try and see how it goes? Or is this a decision that he has made? And he's done this on tariffs. He's done this on the Ukraine. He's done this on every major sort of policy decision that you've seen him talk about in the first what has it been now, 4 months or 4 years? I lose track of the time. It seems like 4 years, but it's only been 4 months.
It really does.
Yeah.
So much has changed. How do you view the current geopolitical landscape and the challenges facing the US?
Fascinatingly dynamic. And I think the Europeans especially are right to be scratching their heads, but I think there is a message there that they are missing. The terms New World Order are overused, or that term is overused. But certainly I think that it's worth talking about the different sort of perspectives that many people in America, not just Donald Trump, have towards some of our traditional relationships, specifically on continental Europe.
How do you see the role of Europe evolving? Because he's had a lot to say about that.
The relationship between the United States and especially continental Europe, the Brits are always going to be a little bit different because of the history, because of the culture. The same is a little bit true with the Irish. Although the Irish seem to be choosing to be more European, but certainly the relationships with the major continental countries, France, Germany, Holland, etc., Italy, are going to be very different, at least for the rest of the Trump term. But I don't think it stops there. I think that what you are simply seeing is a reflection of the attitude that many folks, especially on the right side of the political spectrum, have towards these traditional relationships that we have with continental Europe. It's going to change. It's going to continue to change. It is not driven by Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not causing what you're seeing. Donald Trump is a result of what you're seeing.
What are some of the biggest challenges facing the Trump team in the next couple of months?
Yeah, as I mentioned before I was chief of staff, I was the budget director. So I wrote, I think, 3 budgets for the United States. I think at that time they were $4 or $5 trillion. And I continue to watch the fiscal situation very closely in the country. And I think some people have sort of grasped the fact that the U.S. is going to probably borrow an additional $2 or $2.2 trillion in the markets this year. And that's right. They pay attention to that. And that's rightly so. What I think most people are missing, and this is the answer to your question, which is the biggest challenge I think the Trump team is facing, is that they're going to refinance nearly $10 trillion this year. It's like $9.2 trillion. So everyone knows that the U.S. is $36 trillion in debt. What they don't recognize is that 25% of that debt comes due in the next 8 to 12 months. That's something we've never seen before. That's an economic tsunami, the likes of which I don't know you can even prepare for. And as you and I sit here and have this conversation, Washington is in the midst of debating the one big, beautiful bill, the Trump tax cuts extension, a lot of the other policy changes that he wants to see. But they're doing that against the backdrop of this very, very frightening sort of future for the bond market. Again, the bond market is where we go to the rest of the world and say, hi, would you please lend us a bunch of money? The bond market played a tremendous role that people don't realize, I think, in the change of policy on tariffs, where we went from Liberation Day to the 90-day pause. The bond markets played a role there. The bond markets just played a role in some of the debate on the one big, beautiful bill in the House last week. So people pay a lot of attention to the equity markets, the stock markets. But I think that folks, other than the folks who are in the fixed income world, bankers, are not paying nearly enough attention to the bond markets. And I talk about why that is, and how that impacts not just Trump's policies and Trump's process. But keep in mind, I was in Congress for 6 years, and I know most of the leading members of the House, especially now, and the Senate. I've worked with many of these men and women over the course of the last 15 years, and I know how they will look to the bond markets for advice, or at least guidance and sort of insight. And I think that unique situation of having to refinance almost $10 trillion this year is the biggest thing that nobody's talking about when it comes to the Trump policies.
What is your view right now with everything that's happening between the US and China?
That relationship is probably the single most complicated relationship that I see across geopolitics right now. By the way, the second most complicated is actually US-EU, which we talked about a little bit separately. But the relationship with China is different. And what you're seeing, I understand now. I didn't understand right away, right when the tariffs were announced, what the plan was on tariffs. I think I got it now on what the plan is for tariffs, the tariff threat against the EU and Mexico and Canada and the UK and all that kind of stuff. That I've got. The situation with trade and the larger relationship with China is a lot more complicated because there are geopolitical sort of macro trends that come into play with the U.S.-China relationship that don't come into play with the U.S.-Canada relationship. And I actually think it's easier And it doesn't surprise me that Trump has already said, well, we've made progress with the UK, we've made progress on Mexico, we've made progress with Canada. That doesn't surprise me. And the progress with China will be much more difficult because there are many more variables to the equation. Trump really does see China as a competitor. Enemy is not the right word. Adversary would be one, so short of an enemy. But there's that dynamic that exists between those two economic superpowers and now military superpowers that don't exist between us and, say, the UK. So that has been fascinating to watch, and that will be fascinating to see how it played out. Plus, I was in the discussions in the first term. I've sat across the table with him and President Xi at the the G20 in Osaka. I've seen the two men interact. That's fascinating to talk about it and sort of analyze. I think I know why Trump treats Xi like he does in public, and differently to a certain extent than some of the other world leaders. Like, I certainly think you can make the case that he treats Xi with a lot more deference than he would, say, Emmanuel Macron or even Keir Starmer. So, and I think I know why that is. In fact, I've asked him why that is. So yeah, there's an opportunity, I think, to talk about that relationship in a way that draws important contrasts between what you see with all the sort of the other countries of the world. China really is, I used to practice law a long time ago, what we call sui generis, its own thing. And it sort of takes its own unique analysis.
Why does he treat him differently? If you can share that.
The short version is that, the simple version is that it's simple old-fashioned human nature. You catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar.
In relation to him maybe wanting to crash the market?
I've heard that rumor. I don't believe that. I think if the question is, how does Donald Trump feel about the value of the dollar? Yeah, that's a conversation worth having. Donald Trump, and I'm happy to go into it. I do go into it in my presentations as to why it is, how it is. Donald Trump doesn't like a strong dollar. He likes a weak dollar. And it's not lost on me that the dollar has lost about 15% of its value since the beginning of this year.
Tariffs. Do you believe him when he says that he's doing it fully to stimulate the economy, or do you think that there's some level of insider trading?
Insider trading is illegal in my country. People don't think that it is. It is. Donald Trump can't do it. Members of Congress can't do it. The tariff, there's 3 or 4 different reasons that the Trump team offers for doing tariffs. All of them are right in different circumstances. There's no one answer for each particular country. And I do talk about that at some length in my presentations.
Do you think it's fair to say that he's completely rewritten the political playbook and broken the fourth wall?
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with breaking the fourth wall, by the way.
Yeah.
Trump didn't change it. The country is changing. All of the countries are changing. In fact, I think one of the things I talk about is the rise of populism and why it's happening and what the impact of that would be. Donald Trump could not get elected in 1976. He probably couldn't get elected in 1996. The country is changing, will continue to change. 2 things I'd like to remind folks overseas. Number 1, you'd be stunned at the number of people in 2016, and we've seen the data on this, who voted for Bernie Sanders in the Democrat primary and then voted for Donald Trump in the general election. Now, if you look at the world from the outside, you think, well, that makes absolutely no sense. That's the opposite extremes of the political spectrum. But it's not. And if you view politics as a circle, those 2 things are quite close together. If your only source of information about Donald Trump is coming from European press, there's a giant blind spot. One of my favorite stories, I won't tell it here obviously, talks about the importance of getting good information and the consequences of getting bad information. I do think that the Europeans especially, Asians especially, folks who live outside the continental U.S. get really bad information about Donald Trump, and that's a weakness. We used to call him a news-making machine.
It's good TV.
There's a method of madness about that as well. So about how he manages the flow of news that he creates. That's an interesting question.
I've heard that he's got someone that tweets for him, and he just sits there and says things, and the person just tweets.
Depends. Watch the timestamp. Okay. If it's between 11 o'clock in the morning U.S. East Coast time and about 7 p.m., then it's what you've just described. It's probably Trump with a guy named Dan Scavino, who's a social media director, doing it together. And if you're wondering, does Donald Trump care about the number of ellipses or the number of exclamation points or whether or not this word is capitalized or that word, the answer is absolutely he does. Yeah. If he's tweeting outside of those hours, it's almost always him by himself.
Really?
Yes.
I actually saw a video of him the other day in an interview, and it was him sitting there, and it was like a glass next to him, and he was like, no, this doesn't look good. And he spent about 5 minutes perfecting how the water looked next to him in this interview.
You notice the Diet Cokes. They're always a little bit full. He never drinks the entire Diet Coke. He doesn't want to have the empty bottle sitting on the table. He's a master showman. He really is. He's great at managing the medium of television. Much of his personality, in fact, is defined by his interaction with television.
The media.
He grew up as a child of the television age, is fascinated by it.
But that's how he's changed the playbook, the political playbook, because he's shown how much power that can have and how much power the media has.
One of the reasons that I got the gig as the chief of staff, he told me, I'm not guessing, I'm good on TV. You're good for ratings. By the way, I can't do the voice. I can do the hands. When I'm sober, I can't do the voice. After 2 glasses of wine, I can try it.
We've got some vodka over there.
That's exactly right. But he wants... I remember when I was leaving the White House, this was the beginning of COVID. So I'm leaving in the middle of March of 2020 to take the diplomatic position at the State Department. And the president has just started doing these daily press conferences in the afternoon on COVID. By the way, he would typically do them between 5 and 7 o'clock in the run up to prime time so that he could drive the news cycle. And I remember talking to the team, look, I'm leaving. I recognize the fact I'm not going to have as much, influence here as I had before. Please, 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 if you do one thing, get him off TV in the afternoons on COVID. It's not working. And they just said, look, the ratings are great. He loves it. People are watching.
Even though you're saying drink like gasoline or something.
No, he never said that.
What did he say? He said drink toilet cleaner.
No, people think that he said that you should drink bleach. And that's not what he said. You go back and watch it. And that's been debunked. Yes, he talked about bleach and all that kind of stuff. And
did you enjoy being the chief of staff?
I did. It was the most intense job that I could ever imagine. I would never do it again. Though I'm interested in it. By the way, most chiefs, I think there's only one chief who's ever done it again, and it was a favor to the Bush family. If a dear friend of mine, if Tim Scott or even Joe Kennedy, the Democrat, these are close friends of mine, said, Mick, can you come be my chief of staff? I would do it as a personal favor, but I would never take it as a job again. It's too intense.
You've had one of the most fascinating jobs in modern history.
I have some of the neatest stories to tell. I do try and entertain. It's educating and entertaining. It's not politicking. I am not there defending Donald Trump or attacking Donald Trump. If you're expecting to hire somebody to come in and say, I think Donald Trump should be elected for a third term, you're wrong. If you're expecting somebody to come in and say, I think Donald Trump should be impeached and get out of office, that's not what this is about. I'm not here to give you the political side of things. I'm here to try to inform you about how the man thinks, works, and operates, and also to try and entertain a little bit. And some of the stories are fascinatingly entertaining, and they could only happen to a chief of staff of the President of the United States.
Yeah, it's an amazing title. Thank you, Mick.
Thank you.